Okay, so researching community stories is a project that is running in Sheffield, and the idea behind the project is to try and understand how communities work by collecting and analysing the narratives of the people who live here. So in other words, to work closely with the residents and members of a community to collect rich, complex sets of data about real life experience. It's very much using a sort of narrative approach, utilising kind of narrative based methodologies to get the true story of what it is to live in a community, what makes a community work, what stops a community working. So I mean, when traditional kind of data sets have been generated before, which local authorities and researchers often do, very often it comes out as rather dry and two-dimensional. So one might get sets of tables, broad, quite abstract accounts of tensions or assets within a community. And what we're hoping to do with this methodology, which is very much is kind of based right in the heart of neighbourhoods, is to work alongside people and collect much more fine-grained, detailed, complex material using all sorts of methods like film, writing, visual arts, audio, could be performance. So yeah, and just finally to say on this bit, the project was initiated by the High Sheriff of South Yorkshire. The High Sheriff is a judicial role. It's actually an appointment by the Queen, and traditionally High Sheriffs have been interested in issues around justice, and in more recent years many High Sheriffs have been interested in issues around social cohesion, public health, how communities function. And the previous High Sheriff is a chap called Andrew Coombe. He worked with many different partners in the city, of which the University of Sheffield is one, to develop this project. Okay, so yeah, for the last year we've been doing this kind of development work in schools and with other partners too. And what's now going to happen is that students who are doing an English degree will have an opportunity to become researchers themselves and work with us and with community partners to further this process of research. They will be working with quite a wide variety actually of community partners, schools, community centres, a centre for homeless young people. They'll be working with these varied groups to capture, record, produce, co-produce stories of what it's like to live and work sometimes in that particular community. And what's really exciting about it is that this is a genuine research project. It hasn't been created in order to fill a space in the curriculum. This was a need that was identified by people working in local government, and they came to the university to ask for help to develop it. We've helped them develop that. We've developed a project, we've begun the research, and now we're going to expand that research by supporting students to themselves become researchers and contribute to this project. I think it's really important to say that a key emphasis all the way along has been on co-production, and to try and get away from a model where expertise is cited here in the university, and to try and think of the communities themselves as full of expertise and knowledge, and that the role of the students is to help, but only to help, to produce these articulations and narratives of community life, and also hopefully to begin to analyse them and understand them. So yeah, in the next year students are going to be going out into the community, talking to people, recording people's stories, analysing those stories, and another really exciting thing is that this work that students are producing won't just end up on our desks here in the university. It will also have a life informing people who work in local government, in police, who provide local services in the area. It will also have a role in informing those people about the real life of a community, and help to hopefully produce more targeted, focused, helpful interventions and solutions. While at the same time, also, if it goes well, helping a community to understand itself better and to begin to work on their own solutions and get to know parts of the community they may not have perhaps been familiar with before. So it's quite an exciting model really for students' degrees to include this very real, active, evolving research. Okay, so the Research in Community Stories project will be working in a very specific geographical part of Sheffield, and the area that has been identified for us by the City Council is what we're calling the Abbeydale Corridor. So it roughly stretches from the bottom of London Road, the Sheffield United football ground, up to Nether Edge. The Abbeydale Corridor is an interesting and diverse area. It has a minority ethnic population of around 35%, and I think Sheffield as a whole is around 8 to 10%, so it's diverse. It's culturally interesting because you get a real mix of cultures there. You also get pockets of housing which are home to often largely white middle class professionals, but also more working class areas of housing. Okay, so for the last year, running from the middle of 2011 to the middle of 2012, a small project group has been meeting regularly to develop the Research in Community Stories project. And the project group was comprised of myself and David from the university, some colleagues from the council, the High Sheriff, and we've also had input from the police, from the fire service, from probation service, and from Hallam University, and we've also worked closely with many community partners. And in consultation with people in the community, we've developed, I suppose, the outline of this project.
Okay, so I guess the first really practical thing that we did, i.e. taking the ideas that we discussed around a table into the community, was a project that we called courage mapping. And courage mapping was something that was proposed by a colleague from the council who had observed the way in which a small boy at Nether Edge, who was getting bullied, decided that he didn't really want to talk, or couldn't talk necessarily at the time, about the places in the school in which he was being bullied. It was much easier for him to draw a map, and within that map to say where he felt courageous and where he felt less courageous. And that information produced a much more nuanced means of consulting that child about his experience of school. Places that teachers perhaps had understood as being fine and safe places for the kids were actually not safe places. By telling a story, this child was adding kind of nuance and fine-grained detail to long-held understandings of space and place in the school. So brilliantly, the school council, the children who kind of have a say and input in the running of the school, said this is a great idea. Why don't we do this with across the year group and do it in the wider area? And our colleague in the council got wind of this when he saw that children were doing maps, courage maps as we're calling them, full of really interesting stories about their experiences of the spaces and places around their school. Particularly one place which is in the heart of the area that we're working in, Broadfield Park, a place which many people in the council, adults and teachers, had thought was possibly a bit of an ambiguous space, maybe a site where young people feel threatened, where certain members of the community might feel threatened. But actually, the kids broadly in the school were saying that they felt courageous there. It was somewhere that felt like it was for them. And so what we got there was young people challenging conventional wisdom, telling a new story about a space, having their say. And the notion of a courage map really opens us up to thinking about the way that enabling someone to tell a story is much more authentic in many ways than a tick box exercise about what are the places that you feel safe, what are the places that you don't feel safe, how on a scale of 1 to 10 how would you rate this area in terms of its safeness, or this kind of thing. They're actually saying, tell me about where you feel good, where you feel happy, where you feel comfortable, where you feel courageous. What about less so? So we decided that we would go into the primary schools in the area, working with young people and kind of rolling this out. And what we got was some really interesting responses from across the geographical area in which we're working. So right on the edge at Dore Primary School, which probably is in one of the more wealthy parts of the city, where people tend to have quite a comfortable life, it's fair to say. Down to the bottom of Sharrow, the bottom of the area that we're working in, where probably people's socio-economic background is quite different from the children who attended Dore Primary School. And what we got was obviously some quite different responses, but the main thing was the sheer diversity of experiences. United really by Abbeydale Road, for example, and London Road, this long artery road that stretches through the area. But what we got was a space that we all know, that we all walk through, suddenly became populated with stories, with voices, with young people's voices, with the voices of 6-year-old children. Who ever asked 6-year-old children what they think about an area? Well, actually it's really important to, because they're kind of crucial components of an area. They're representative of it, they're hugely representative of it. So talking to them in this way, encouraging their creativity, encouraging them to be a part of this conversation, to contribute their stories, is really giving a platform for the project, and is creating a model that we hope will kind of define the Research and Community Stories project as we go forth, working with students, working in partnership across the community. So my research interests can probably be categorised in a lot of different ways. But I would say, in the most direct and simple sense, I'm a film studies lecturer and researcher. I'm interested in what films have to tell us about our cities, our country, our communities, and so I'm particularly interested in films which aim to be realistic, what we might call in this country social realism. So attempts to render authentically place, space, landscape, characters, lives. And I'm interested in the types of narrative models and aesthetic motifs that can be understood within a tradition that supports that aim of realism. And so I finished my PhD and written a few articles which were coming out of my PhD. My PhD really explored that tradition of filmmaking, realist filmmaking, from the 1930s to the present day really, and I still continue to work in that area. But I became quite interested in thinking about perhaps the other dimensions. So we've done a lot I've done a lot, for example, on the landscapes that films portray, but how do individuals who occupy those landscapes respond to that portrayal? How might individuals who occupy those landscapes form kind of counter-narratives? Can we think about film in a more applied context? Can we go beyond simply thinking about films that are produced for a particular audience and then analysing those films? Can we think about the way images function in our daily lives, the way we might kind of generate filmic understandings and perspectives of our communities, of our cities, that might speak to the traditions that I'm talking about, might speak to that realist tradition, for example, but might also benefit from being analysed in the same way that great films, apparent work of arts, can be understood. works of art rather. So a good example of what we did with that, and a practical example, would be that I started working with a school in 2010 around this idea to try and explore some of the ways in which people who occupied particular landscapes, i.e. in this case Sheffield, might respond to those filmic landscapes, okay, or respond to those landscapes filmically. So I worked with a group of school children, showed them a documentary film about Sheffield, got them to note down places, and this is a documentary film from the 1970s, so bear in mind that we were in 2010 working with a group of 6 and 7 year olds. This is going to seem like a completely different world to them, but there are still traces of recognition, places that they've been, landscapes that they've occupied, spaces, places that they've visited, experiences that they've had. And what I got them to do was start to populate that film with their own stories. To say, I've been there, I did this there, I've been there, I did this there. This place is unfamiliar, I haven't been there, that's changed. That's a place that I now go to in this guise, for example. So there's no meadow hall in this film. There's no mosque, for example, where a lot of the kids went to worship. So what I asked the children to do is to update that film, to think about film in a different way, as something beyond just reception, and think of it as a platform to be creative, a platform to say something about your own life. And so I was interested in this idea of children becoming creative readers, and they created a filmic narrative which was their Sheffield on film, responding to this documentary image of Sheffield. And what I then did in my research was to analyse the kinds of decisions they made, the kinds of emphases they placed on the places, locations and spaces that were important to them in their community. And in asking them to think about their community in spatial terms, I guess, in terms of in visual terms, very much in terms of creating a visual narrative, what I was probably intending to do was to get them to stop and think a little bit about the story of their city, the story of their community, the multiple stories, the way in which, for example, when they see a visual narrative on the television, in the cinema, it's akin to the way they experience place and space on a daily basis, the way they construct stories about their city and about their community. So as a model of engagement and as a platform to creativity, this was quite an interesting way into kind of to negotiating that nagging concern for me about my sort of more orthodox academic research, that it wasn't really speaking to a particular audience. It wasn't speaking, in fact, to the audience that it presumes to be engaged with, the people who occupy the spaces that these films are about, that I so avidly and rigorously studied. So that's kind of where my research kind of fits in to this more socially engaged mode of analysis and inquiry.
I've always been really interested in narrative, and my interest in narrative and how it works and what it is and what it does, I suppose, started in a fairly conventional way through analysing narrative form in literary texts and thinking about the way form can itself tell a story, and sometimes it tells a story that's different to the ostensible kind of plot of a narrative. But my PhD really kind of took that a little further, and it was, I suppose, thinking about the importance of stories to being a person, to our daily lives, to the ways in which we negotiate with the world and with ourselves too, the way we negotiate with issues around power and gender, money and class. And my particular interest has always been mental health and mental illness as well. And for me, it's always been understanding how narrative works in mental health contexts has always been a really, really important thing. So there's a big story told about people with mental health problems, and you could kind of use this as an analogy for the ways in which stories get told about a community that might not seem to be functioning. So there are big stories told about people with mental health problems. There are often stories about incapacity, deficit, dysfunction, difficulty, lack. And these stories are often told by people who have power or authority. So whether it be a politician or a psychiatrist, sometimes with good intentions, these stories they have a certain power. And I was really interested to watch and see how a process happened in which other people's stories came to define individuals. So instead of telling and creating their own story, it was like they'd swallowed someone else's story, and that came to define them. And I was really interested to see how spaces of resistance, strategies to produce counter-narratives could be introduced, the way in which one could crack open narrative forms and make something new happen, something creative emerge. And yeah, so my PhD, I suppose, was on texts, it was on books, but it was on autobiographical texts written by people with mental health problems. And it was a very close analysis of the ways in which people tried to use the potential of narrative and language to retell their story and make it into something more empowering, more amenable actually to who they felt they wanted to be, who they perhaps felt they actually were. And of course the idea of stories being important to well-being and mental health is not a new one at all. Certainly in kind of modern times we might date that interest from the talking cure, from the development of the talking cure in the 19th century, when doctors actually began to sit down and listen to people telling a story, and psychiatrists and psychoanalysts would actually help people to retell and reframe that story. So perhaps it made more sense, or perhaps it was just more comfortable to live within. So where I've got to now, and it's a long story but cut it short, is I also think that communities can be defined by the stories that are told about them, and it's kind of interesting to explore quite what space there might be for new stories to emerge, particularly perhaps where different stories are brought together, where stories are brought into dialogue with each other, perhaps in a kind of creative collision with each other.
So about 3 years ago we started the Story in Sheffield project, where we're working with a specific group alongside our students to kind of explore the ways in which stories that we tell about ourselves can, in some ways, I guess in broad terms, improve certain aspects of our lives, and in analysing and being more analytical about the stories of our lives, and then representing those stories, kind of showing them in different ways, through film, through visual art, through creative writing. We were able to develop more subtle means of understanding the self, and also to kind of achieve a degree of distance in a way that perhaps augments more traditional grand stories and grand narratives that people tell about particular groups, for example. And if we're thinking about a community, that kind of model can be redeployed, so that we can say, well, in some senses, when we think about a community, you might say, well, that community is known for this, for crime, for example, for antisocial behaviour, let's say, or that community is known for being full of wealthy middle class people, that's where all the good schools are, etc, etc. So in a sense, one story is being told about that community, and I think one of the great lessons from Story in Sheffield is that kind of narrative categorisation is reductive, and it can have a negative human effect. And in deploying these kinds of modes of narrative inquiry to a community, we can start to acknowledge, I think, the complexity and the complex array of narratives that go towards making a more cohesive community. If we imagine a community as a set of stories, a set of sometimes conflicting stories, sometimes coexisting stories, it seems only logical and natural to say, well, let's look at what those stories are, what they look like, and how they speak to one another. Where do those tensions arise? where do those narratives not fit one another, and in kind of capturing those stories and then allowing them to be shared, we enable them to speak to one another. And in doing that, we might begin to say, well, perhaps those stories now understand each other more. And that's kind of an aim really of the course, is to think about, and the project more broadly, is to think about communities really as collections of diverse stories, many stories, and to acknowledge that diversity, but in so doing produce a new mode of reading and understanding and feeling really a community.